Welcome back for our third and final session of the 2026 Summer Session. As is our tradition, we'll start with an opening service, be officiated by Reverend Blayne Higa, the director of the Buddhist Study Center, and the chanting, which is Jodo Shinshu, people chant as a way to interconnect with one another, because when we, chant the words, we hear each other, we hear the teachings, we hear the sound of each other's voices, and we synchronize our breathing, and we, kind of become one. So that's the feeling when you're chanting, also listen for those all around, okay? The chanting tonight will be verses reaffirming the vows, or the English version of Jusege. Jusege is from the larger sutra. It's part of a very ancient chanting tradition that's found on page 117 of the Red Service Book in front of you. Reverend Higa.
Namandab, 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 namandab. Light brighter than sun. I shall be a guide to all, like the wisdom of my teacher. May my wisdom also shine all throughout the universe and illumine one and all. If I shall fulfill these vows, may all lands tremble with joy. From the heavens wondrous flowers rain down upon all the land. The virtue of Amida's vow is shared equally by all, together attaining awakened mind. We are born in the land of peace. Namanda, 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 Namanda.
Test. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Dex, for covering it for me a little bit. Traffic's kind of bad. Good evening to day 3, our final day, here at the Buddhist Study Center with Reverend Dr. Aaron Proffitt. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we'd like to welcome Dr. Proffitt, Reverend Dr. Proffitt. He was one of our classmates at our Tokudo last October. And I'm glad to call him our Hancho because he was the leader of our group there in Tokudo. Aaron is an associate professor of Japanese studies at the State University of New York in Albany. He studied at the University of Colorado Boulder for his bachelor's and master's degrees, and at the University of Michigan for his PhD in Buddhist studies. Professor Proffitt received a Fulbright Fellowship to conduct research at Otani, Koyasan, and Ryukoku universities. As I mentioned, he received Tokudo in October 2025 with us. And also, he co-founded the Albany Buddhist Sangha, which is associated with the New York Buddhist Church, where he is mentored by Reverend Earl Ikeda, former retired Hawaii Hongaji minister. I'd like to introduce Reverend Dr. Proffitt. Yeah, sorry. We're going to have a short 5-minute break, See, I told you, that's why. We're going to have a short 5-minute break while we reset. So please enjoy refreshments, grab something to drink, and we'll resume in about 5 minutes, about maybe 6:15. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to share something that we did at the Spring Festival that was held here at the Buddhist Study Center. And it was called, this is one of the booths that was put up by the Commission on Buddhist Education at Debbie Kubota. And it was called Appreciating Our Ohana. Because this year, as the Hongaji theme, it is our appreciating or sharing our gratitude. And so in sharing our gratitude and appreciating our ohana, people who came to the Spring Festival wrote how they appreciated their ohana on these little Bodhi leaves. And so this evening, you will also have a chance to add your Bodhi leaf to this Bodhi tree and following the theme, appreciating our ohana. And so anytime we have the break, you'll be able to go to the back. We'll have this on our table, and there are leaves and pens available for you to write on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'd like to welcome back my good buddy over here. Here you go.
Greetings and thank you again. I've been looking forward to this for so long. It's so, it's just so wonderful to be here. I've been, writing and thinking about these topics, and one of the strategies I've been using is like voice recording while I'm out walking my dog or driving. A thought will occur to me, like, oh wow, that goes here, right? I just hit record. So it's wonderful to be finally here and sharing. So the overarching theme for my talks this for this summer session is the theme rethinking Buddhist education. Yeah. So I really began thinking about this kind of in two modes. First as a university professor, but then also as a father. How do I share the Dharma with my kids? How do I teach students about Buddhism who know nothing about religion? 20 years ago, when I first began teaching college students at the University of Colorado, then University of Michigan, a certain percentage, I could assume, had some amount of churching, some knowledge that I could draw upon. Then I got to the University of Albany, and not only was that not the case, but not only did they not have churching, they didn't know much about religion at all. So I really got to kind of have a blank slate and then think about how do you introduce this stuff, bit by bit. Yeah. Some of the fruits of that dialogue appear in the form of the American Buddhist Study Center lecture series that I've been working on for a few years. Before COVID, I was invited down to do a book talk comparing the Koyasan Shingon monk Dohan to Shinran, both living at about the same time, both writing about the Pure Land, but with very different perspectives. Yeah. And then Hoshina Seki asked me, hey, do you ever do online teaching? I was like, yeah, I love online teaching. I have a Buddhism and film class. I have I do a couple different things online. Then COVID hit, year passes. She brings it up again next time I go down to the temple. So since then, I have I think about 30 lectures from, what is Buddhism, all the, through China, Japan, Korea, Tibet. We just finished a suite on esoteric Buddhism, and I've got a few other things planned as well. So in any case, so I've been thinking about it, again, how do we teach about Buddhism online? How do we teach Buddhism in the college classroom? As my kids started toddling about, thinking, I can't just let Buddhism be that weird thing that Dad does. It's too valuable. Especially, I'm thinking, what if they grow up neurotic like me? They're going to need something, right? Buddhism has been too helpful for me, turning out, not winding up in prison, for example, and then so on, right? I'm a relatively civilized person, which is not what you would have guessed if you'd known me in younger years, right? I attribute a lot of that to the Dharma. So I'm thinking for my kids, what do I have? And, there's so much to choose from. Buddhism is diverse. But I know Shin Buddhism is good for families, good for kids. And it's the tradition that has felt most intimate to me for 20 years. So that again, thinking about Buddhist education. And then I've had opportunities, I've been invited to speak with priests in training to provide kind of doctrinal, historical knowledge as well. And again, like that's a very different audience. How do we talk about Buddhist education? Okay. So one of my first points here for today is Buddhism is simple, right? And I know for a lot of us are like, wait, no, it's not. What are you talking about? That's ridiculous. But stay with me, okay? So, one time in class, a student came up to me and said, "You talk about Buddhism like it's a bug under glass." She didn't mean this as an insult. She was talking about my kind of critical academic distance, right? I'm not trained as a theologian, and I am very clear that, occasionally I get invited to a temple and they want me to do an academic talk. I can do that. When I go to an academic conference, though, I don't do a Dharma talk. I'm pretty good about, kind of figuring out how to do that. But this student was noting, like, you're talking about something that is of the utmost importance to people in such like a cold, rational way. She didn't mean it as an insult, it was an observation, right? Because in the academic study of religion, that's essentially what we're trained to do. That's what we learn to do, is to, it's funny because, you think about the history of religions, many people assume that the discipline is about becoming a walking Wikipedia entry. Did you know the Muslims, da-da-da-da? Did you know that the Hindus, they do da-da-da-da? No, that's not it at all. The study of religion is actually really the study of how people use language, as much as anything. How does stories work? So not just what does it say, what does a story say, what does it mean, what does it do? That's what the academic study of religion is really about, is how people use language in the world. If a given story is taken at face value, who stands to benefit from taking that seriously? Who stands to lose? Right? The scholar of religion is asking these types of questions. I may be biased here, but I think religious studies is one of, if not the best of the humanities disciplines. Yeah. Anthropologists might not have to talk about religion. Religious studies scholars have to talk about anthropology, though. Historians might not have to talk about religion. Religious studies scholars have to talk about history. We don't get to leave anything out. We have to cover all of it. Yeah. I was talking with a colleague of mine who works on Confucianism. He's like, I don't touch that Buddhism stuff. It's like quicksand. It's too much more new stuff, so I just stick with Confucius. It's before Buddhism, it's easier, right? Buddhist studies scholars who work on East Asia, we don't have that luxury. We have to talk about Confucius. We have to talk about Taoism, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah? So that's why I think religious studies is such a good discipline, because we have to cover a little bit of everything. Because, again, religion is not special. It's human stuff. It's about humanity. It's not some other thing that can be bracketed out as a separate thing. But that distance that the scholar of religion is supposed to cultivate, we introduced, in my intro class, we introduced a thing called methodological atheism. Doesn't mean everybody has to be an atheist. In fact, most scholars of religion happen to belong to the traditions they study. That's just a demographic fact, right? Students will, they must all be atheists. Like, no, they're not, right? The scholars of the Bible who will tell you that, Moses definitely didn't write the Torah. That doesn't mean they're an atheist. That means that they're historically critically informed. And, this particular student, this is the beginning of the semester, so they didn't know me that well yet. But what has happened a few times in my class is that a student comes in very disillusioned about religion. But in the course of a semester with me, while I'm talking about the bugs under the glass, they come to see that you can be critically, historically informed, skeptical even, and also deeply engaged with the tradition. So one year I had a student who was ready to drop Christianity to become a Buddhist. I'm like, okay, cool. Right? But throughout the course of the class, I had demonstrated that, hey, you can be a member of a tradition, be critically informed, and that can work together. And that ultimately helped him kind of rehabilitate, how do we think critically about Christianity? right? And he left the class a Christian again, you know? Not saying I lost one for our team. I'm just saying, like, you know, like. Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you another story about a student. So I had this student who he took a bunch of my classes. You know, every now and again when I teach a class, I'll have a student from East Asia come in. My university has a lot of international students. And they walk in, they see me, they see this face. It's like, wait, hold on, it says Mahayana Buddhism. Him? Really? You know, they look at me and I'm like, they do this look. I know, hold on. It'll be okay, I promise, right? And then sure enough, we get into it. And this is one of these students who, after that initial startling encounter, he stuck around. He took a bunch of my classes. We got to know each other pretty well. And he goes back to China for his grandmother's funeral. And he comes back and he's upset. And he basically felt like the priest that oversaw the funeral was extorting the family for money. He came back feeling icky. Something about this wasn't right. And I realized in this moment that he was coming to me as a grieving person, as someone who was experiencing religious trauma. He was not looking for, did you know, in China 1,000 years ago, blah, blah, blah. He was not looking for that. He was looking for an authentic Buddhist conversation. He came to me as a Buddhist, hoping that this other Buddhist can give him some historical context. Is there something about the Buddhist tradition that can help me understand what just happened to us? Right? So in that moment, I realized, and at the beginning of my teaching career, I was very clear on the teaching versus preaching. Right? When I'm in the university classroom, and still even now, when I'm in my classroom role, I'm not there to convince anybody of anything. Heck, when I'm in my priestly role, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm trying to say, hey, here's some stuff we can know about the world, right? So in that moment, I kind of set aside my scholar hat, and I was like, what does it mean to be authentically present with someone as a Buddhist? This is one of the first times I really had to do that. We had a good conversation, and I felt like I helped. And I came out the other side of that encounter thinking, do I want to really pursue ministry? It's a thing that has been kind of floating in my head since early grad school. I do one thing at a time, right? Get the PhD, but this little inkling, like, you meet these great teachers and they're so inspiring. Can you follow in that path, right? And this was an encounter that kind of helped guide me in a particular direction as well. And I realized that I don't really have to choose between the two. Right? You can be both. You can do both productively, compassionately. The critical distance of the scholar is a tool. It is a way to begin the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation. Now this was just kind of funny. 2014, we show up. I got a 6-month-old baby, and my wife. We're in Tokyo, and I got to go for the Fulbright intake interview, right? And we're having the conversation. I'm talking about my research, talking about our plans in Japan, and at one point the director goes, "Don't take this the wrong way, but you don't seem like a scholar." I was like, "Thanks, bro." I know what that means, What he meant was, you communicate and you seem to be genuinely excited about what you work on. I meet scholars all the time who, I listen to a talk and I'm like, this is the topic you've devoted your life to, and you seem so bored by it. How could that be? So in teaching, right, our broader theme, rethinking Buddhist education, is that when we're sharing the thing that we care about, share your love for that. I was just speaking with one of my mentors, Reverend Chiemi Onikura Blayne, and she was talking about some of her favorite ministers in Japan, people who really share their joy in the Nembutsu, They share their appreciation for the Dharma, and you can really feel that. Sometimes, and I do this often. Here's a lot of information. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, right? And other teachers, they really share that kind of intimate experience that they have. And they invite you to perhaps think about your own encounters with the Dharma, your own appreciation. And each of us may have something different. What is it about the Dharma that excites us? Why do we show up in a room like this? When we get to our Q&A portion, I would love to hear more about that. Like what is it that brought you here? What is it that, of the things you could spend your time doing? As a parent with young kids, I have friends and neighbors, and they might have a job, they might have a religion, but they have a third major occupation, and that's travel sports teams. Their kids are invited. I hear about the schedule of these things. I was like, I already have a job, I'm already married, I already have a religion, I don't need another thing that's going to take up my life. So we make choices. Tuesday evening is Dharma School. Tuesday evening is Sangha time. Oh, but we got to practice. No, we don't. We have Dharma School. Right? Oh, but I get invited. This is what we do, right? And I don't know if you know that I'm not a very strict person, but I believe in being deliberate in the way that we organize our lives, the way that we organize our families, and to really set that time aside. It communicates to the kids, this is a value. This matters. I care about this. So when we have opportunity to share the Dharma, let that joy shine, right? My favorite term, that in collected works of Shinran gets glossed as Shinjin with asterisk. It's Shingyo, right? Joyful, interesting. That's my favorite word, right? Because the second character, Gyo, is Tanoshi, right? To Tanoshi the Dharma, right? I love it. Okay. So, also back to this idea of the bug under glass. Many scholars kind of maybe suppress their enjoyment so that they can appear objective, right? That's a bummer. Let's not do that. Let's share what we love. Let's show that we love these things. Okay. So, kind of hard to see. What we have here are two people in a long trench coat, wearing a beard. So, assuming these are two children wearing a long trench coat, wearing a beard, trying to get into an R-rated movie. Okay. Linguists who study English will say English isn't really one language. English is like 5 languages standing on each other's shoulders in a trench coat, pretending to be one language. Right? Is Buddhism like that too? No. One ticket, please. One Buddhism, please. Right? So when I teach my semester-length course, Introduction to Buddhism, we start in India. We go to, what we covered, the Theravada traditions, we do India, and then I talk about the things that are shared traditions. I'm getting this from Don Lopez's Norton Anthology of World Religions Buddhism volume. It talks about shared traditions. These are this is basic Buddhism, the things that all Buddhists are kind of doing. Yeah. Then I do Theravada, women in Buddhism. There's a habit, scholars of Buddhism will do a women in Buddhism chapter. Guess where they put it? The end of the book, right? Oh, by the way, there's women or whatever. No, ma'am. No, ma'am, right? So I try to introduce this early and repeat it frequently, right? The reason we have Buddhism as a functioning thing is because of women, right? If you spend time in Sangha, who's actually running the show? It's women, right? When someone's looking for a new Sangha, I always tell them, look for the aunties. Because if there's aunties, there's going to be accountability, right? And the food will probably be better. No aunties, I don't want to eat there, right? And if the temple didn't have any food, forget it. I'm sorry. So at the end of the semester, students will say, what even is Buddhism? We've been studying all these things, right? India, women in Buddhism, China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Vietnam, modern Buddhism, which is a whole other thing. What even is this? And I say, guess what, guys? I'm also teaching an introduction to religion class. And guess what people ask me in my section after Judaism? Same thing. What even is Judaism? Like, I know. What even is Christianity, right? And we get into the complex historical nuances of this, that, and the other. Did you know that early Islam is basically indistinguishable from kind of Judeo-Christian stuff in Arabia, right? Arabian Christians also say Allah. Right? Where's the dividing line? It's it's surprisingly complicated, but everything is if you actually study it. Yeah. So I tell them the same thing. So it's not really a question about Buddhism, it's a question about people, how people live and act. Again, scholars like their food not to touch, but human beings, everything's all mixed up. Yeah. So at the end of class, I always tell them, I have a slide, the last slide of each of my classes. I say, listen guys, you're probably going to remember some inappropriate story I told about hanging out with Yakuza in Japan. Probably, right? But if I can have you remember one thing, it's this. Religions arise dependent upon causes and conditions, in particular cultural contexts. They are internally diverse and constantly changing, and nowhere therein is there a fixed essence. Right? Those of you who know your basic Buddhism know what I'm actually saying, right? And that's true. Like that's the bedrock of the academic study of religion, right? What is real Islam? Like, well, there are historical claims made about what real Islam is, and we look at those historical contexts and understand why people say what they say, right? But scholars don't come in and say, aha, I have found it. This is the real Islam. Real Islam, please stand up. Same thing with Buddhism. Yeah. So in a sense, the scholar is looking at the emptiness of these things, right? Of course, the problem with the word emptiness is that in English, if I say emptiness, we have, it may conjure up in your mind a black and white French film, fellow wearing a beret, smoking an unfiltered cigarette saying, life is meaningless. All right, if I say emptiness, that's the image that's conjured up. However, the word for emptiness can also mean, I was hoping I'd have a chance to do this. All right. So one of the characters for emptiness, right? Ku in Japanese, Kong in Chinese.
Sorry, I'm bringing your mic so you guys on Zoom can hear you.
Oh, thanks so much. Oh, sorry. Great. Thanks so much. Oh, there we go. Okay, very good. Thank you. My apologies to our Zoom friends. So we have this character, Ku in Japanese or Kong in Chinese, and it can mean, easier to see. Thank you. Yeah, see, we're all learning together. Okay. So the character Ku, this is one of the characters for emptiness. This can also mean open, and it can mean sky. So when we think of emptiness, it doesn't mean something is devoid of value. It means that things are open, fluid, right? When I started learning more about the teachings of emptiness, the philosophy of emptiness, I realized it's about change as well. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to share that little character there. So I tell my students that, no, Buddhism is simple. It's the academic study of religion that's complicated, right? Buddhism is simple. Your mom does not need to learn and read Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika, okay? When I did a course on this, this is post-tenure, so I wanted to do something weird. I just wanted to read Nagarjuna for a semester. And, I had a student, she's looking at me one day, we're talking, she's like, I feel like I have a concussion. Yeah. It's like, my dear, I do too. This is really hard, right? But that's why we're doing it, because it's also really rewarding. Another time, another student was like, the more I understand, the further away from it it feels. Like, it's really hard, right? I warned them, I said, listen, guys, this is going to be the hardest thing you ever read in your life. But if you stick with me, this will be an easy A. Right? Just keep showing up, keep trying. And it was a blast. I had about 8 students in that class. It was phenomenal. Your mama doesn't need to read that, right? If you take, seminars and advanced readings in Asian texts, like, yeah, you might want to read that, right? But you don't have to. You don't have to know that to be a Buddhist. Similarly, your uncle doesn't need to know William James, great philosopher and psychologist and scholar of religion from the late 1800s. Cool to read, but he doesn't need to know that, right? So Buddhist studies as an academic discipline, yeah, that's kind of complicated. Yeah. But actual living Buddhism, it's about community. It's about life. It's about the thing that I like to always point to is the potluck. This one time I was at the Denver temple, right? There for Obon, and I'm sitting with one of the priests or minister's assistants, and drinking a beer, eating some chicken teriyaki, and I'm fresh out of Kumamoto, so that's my that's always my default mode, but especially at that time, right? And the minister says something like, a lot of people think Buddhism is about the meditation cushion, but if you think the meditation cushion is more important than this right here, than the potluck, you got kids running around screaming, it's loud, it's hot. If you think the meditation cushion is more important than the potluck, then you've missed the point. And I think about that a lot, because there's a lot of books all about the meditation cushion, not a lot of books about the potluck. And that's where real Buddhism is happening. That's where Buddhism is a living, breathing thing. It's the potluck, it's the altar offering, it's that half-read book that is gathering dust sitting on all of our bookshelves, right? We all have those. I have several. I have bookshelves of material gathering dust. Okay. One time I was interviewed, and the host stopped and said, "Wow, it just seems like Buddhism is just ordinary life." And I think I mentioned this last night. I was like, "Yeah, man, it is. It's keeping it together." When I got to get the socks on the kid, when my kids were little, getting them both out the door with shoes and socks on. Imagine, if you will, you have two monkeys who live in your house, and you have to put socks and shoes on them. Monkeys don't like to wear socks and shoes, do they? Right? I'd get one of them done, and then the other one would have taken them back off again. My daughter, when she was a baby, we lived in Japan, and you're learning all the rules. In Japan, there's lots of rules. So she'd walk in the house, she'd take her shoes and socks off. She's like 1. She knows what to do. But then she would crawl around the room and find the other babies and take their socks off too. Like that was just a thing that she did, right? But as a young father, that's very stressful, But taking a moment to breathe, drawing on the teaching of the Dharma about patience, and then I just pick them both up with no socks or shoes. I put them in their car seats, and then I put the socks and shoes on. Skillful means, right? Another story about a student. We're taking a field trip to a local Buddhist temple, and but one of my students is not able to go. But she says, I gotta run to work, but I want to swing by and give you something. So we're in the front of campus. Everybody shows up. Everybody brought a friend too. So if I take a field trip, it's like on a Saturday. We got to leave at like 8 a.m. 25 people sign up, 10 show up. Right. This was in the evening though, so 20 people signed up, 45 people showed up because everybody brought a friend. And it was a blast. It was a party. It was super cool. But this one student, she couldn't go. She really wanted to. So she brought a big bag of oranges and a big box of tea. Chinese American. She knows about merit. She knows that you bring something to offer to the monks and nuns. So that was her practice, this offer of generosity. Everyone else is going to go there. We'll chant the Heart Sutra. We'll sit in meditation. We'll be good Buddhists or whatever. She's also practicing in that moment, right? To many of the students who attend, they might not recognize that as practice, but that's practice, yeah? So this was not an assignment. This was not something I encouraged. This is something that she independently was like, hey, this is what we need to do here, yeah? This one time I went to my friend's house. This is my friend who helped co-found this Albany Buddhist Sangha with me. And I was asking him, like, hey, I was telling him that I have this practice that I learned back in Japan. Is when you come home with with your groceries, have the kids take the piece of find the best piece of fruit, and then that goes on the altar. And this is just a thing I learned a long time ago. That once my kids were up and around, and when they're real little, they say, "Oh, we're giving Buddha a snack." It's like, well, okay, guys, actually, it's about interconnectedness. I'm doing, That's about how, the orange represents the confluence of elements. The kids have run off, and now they're fighting over whose orange is the better orange. And let's not fight. Being a Buddhist dad is kind of tiring sometimes. But anyway, so I'm telling my friend, like, hey, have you guys done this? Like, do you know about this? He's like, oh, no. So I tell him a little bit about it, and I say, hey, would you like my son to show your daughter how to do this? So I call him over. And so they grab the basket and they start looking through it. They find good orange. They run upstairs to a room that my friend is very handy. He's like a carpenter type, and he had built a little shrine room for the family. They got a little Nembutsu scroll there and some books and things like that. And then the kids don't come down for maybe 10, 15 minutes. They were just enjoying this peaceful space that this father created for his family, right? It was a beautiful moment, and I felt very proud that I could just suggest to my son, hey, why don't you go share this practice? And they did. They made it their own, right? So for my upcoming talks about Buddhism in the family, if you weren't able to attend the Jikoen talk, that's really the main point, is that you can create things in your life, and for children to make the Dharma their own. But for example, I was just brought this lovely gift from the Betsuin bookstore, where you take these nice stickers of the Buddha and different offerings and whatnot, right? I've got the flowers and the Namo Amida Butsu and petals, but then this goes in here and folds up as a little personal altar, right? So I'm excited to take this home and share with Dharma School and whatnot. And in our Dharma School in Albany, we've done some similar things, building little shrines for the kids. Yeah. So finding opportunities to make it come alive, right? It's not a thing that sits on the bookshelf. It's not Dad's hobby. It's not a thing that Dad leaves for a week to go. Well, okay, in my case, I've been invited speaker, so I am leaving for a little while to do this. But it's not like the retreat center model where Mom or Dad leaves, right? And that's Buddhism. We just went grocery shopping. Please help me put things away. And by the way, go tend to the Butsudan. Yeah. I once had a student I told a story like this in class one time, and I had a student say that her mom would never let her touch the altar. Like, what if you messed up? What if you made Buddha mad? I'd never thought of that. Should I be worried about that? Could be, that's what the wrathful deities are for, right? So I remember thinking about that, like, what an unfortunate thing, that this young woman has grown up with a family altar that she feels so disconnected from, that she learns the name of the image on her family altar in my classroom. I don't deserve that honor, right? So what I want to say is that ultimately, Buddhism is simple because it's about our lives. It's as close to you as it can be, right? When Shinran Shonin says, Amida Buddha, is saving me, right? Shinran talks about I alone, like that intimacy, that interiority, right? It's as simple as it gets. So we could think of Buddhism as accessible, embodied, ordinary, no graduate degree required, right? Remember, I mentioned this yesterday as well. Which is a greater expression of wisdom and compassion? A practice that requires tons of money, tons of time, tons of training, 3 PhDs, up on top of the mountain away from your family, or something anybody can do, Namo Amida Butsu. That rhymed, by the way. Anyway. Same thing, when we're talking about Buddhism, which is most representative of Buddhism? The elite of the elite, the 1% of the 1%, and what they say is Buddhism, or the Buddhism that is generally shared by most people? The Buddhism that is accessible, that is present in people's lives. From that perspective, thinking about yesterday, Shin Buddhism is basic Buddhism. It's not some other thing. Yeah? The Buddhism of the Buddhologists, that's complicated. Yeah. Yeah. But Buddhism, when taken seriously, doesn't only bring comfort to us, it proposes a way to change how we see reality. To see things as they are. And when we spend time with the Dharma, naturally things begin to shift. Now, a few years ago, our Albany Sangha brought down about, I think, 9 people to the New York Buddhist Church because Bishop Harada was in town and he was doing the Kieshki ceremony, the refuge ceremony. So we brought all these people down. It was a big party. It was great. We designed a Dharma School lesson. We shared with some parents down there as well. And Bishop Harada told this story about, this is not the practice of self-power. This is the practice of deep listening, of other power. And he gave the example of the smoked salmon. The salmon doesn't take on the flavor because you put it there. You put the salmon in the smoker, and the smoke kind of slowly begins to permeate, right? That's how the Dharma works. You spend time with the Dharma, you spend time in community, and slowly your perspective, your understanding begins to change. Not because you made it happen, but because you are in a state of change whether you like it or not. You're in a state of change surrounded by Dharma. That's the flavor you begin to take on. Yeah. Down south we say, I'm going to marinate on that, right? Similar idea. So something simple like bringing oranges to the temple versus seeing the world as it actually is, these may seem different, but they're actually interconnected things. Ways that the Dharma, the depth and profundity and philosophy of the Dharma is actually present in ordinary life. And I have a colleague who tells this story, if I might borrow, is that they really learned about Buddhism living with their I believe it was their grandmother. Not because their grandmother would then say, and then the Sanskrit original is is not giving a dissertation on some information, right? Now that's fun, trust me, that's what I do professionally, I like it. But it's just the lived experience, seeing how this relative lived her life day to day. That was teaching the Dharma, right? The way that you comport yourself, the way you hold the door open for someone, the way that you sit before the Butsudan, the way that the mundane things that you feel like you can ignore if you know how to pay attention. I think this is one of the great skills of Buddhism, is learning how to pay attention. You start to see the Dharma in the everyday. Yeah. I sometimes hear from people who are raised in Dharma communities and are like, yeah, but we don't learn anything. Like, where's the philosophy, right? And then, on the other end of it, people who are in the academic sphere are like, oh, but how does it come down to earth? It's all just ideas. How does it come to it? You're having very similar conversations. But if you put the two together, then you begin to see that in the ordinary, that's where the depth and beauty of the philosophy actually comes to life, actually comes to be true, right? And similarly, if you set down your books for a little while and go hang out at the potluck, you're like, oh, here it is, right? So like yesterday I mentioned, I try to take my students to the potlucks when I can, because that's when you get to see the Dharma doing its work. Yeah. So here we are with all this wonderful food. Yeah. So with that, I will pause for this, and then we'll come back in a moment for Buddhist Studies is Complicated. Do the fun part first, I think. Great. All right. So any questions, comments, things you would like to share? Please.
Gotta be at the back of the room. Make me run.
You're
I
gonna get
would
your
like
steps
to-
in.
I would like to say, for me, yeah, I think this is the best presentation you have done for me, because of who I am. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I do have a question. What would you say are the key? Well, let's arbitrarily pick 3. What would you say are 3 keys for our society to achieve world peace?
I think listening is really important, right? Listening so that we can learn things we don't already know, right? I think we often end up in our own silos, you know? I get to be a bit odd because I'm born and raised in the rural South, right? I know and love a lot of conservatives, but I have lived in college towns for the past, several decades, so I know and love lots of liberals too, right? And I think that's painfully rare in our society. And you could say the same thing about racial diversity, the way that so much of our country is very, self-segregating. If you grow up in the suburbs, it's like the city where I live, Albany City, very diverse. That's where we live, surrounded by suburbs that are 99% white. And one of my colleagues said when we moved there, we shifted the demographics of the whole suburb just by moving there, right? So I think that in many ways we can learn how to listen to each other and how to connect with people who are different than us. I think it's important. And just like in the academic study of religion, we look at how certain statements or ideas benefit some and not others, right? The more divided we are, who stands to benefit from that and who stands to lose? But honestly, I don't know how to answer that wonderful question, if I'm being real.
How did that Chinese student that returned from her grandmother's funeral end up after he talked to you?
He was okay. This was mid-semester. We got to see each other quite a bit more. He didn't. I think that if I remember correctly, I tried to explain a few different perspectives on how to think about karma. Because karma is, I think, a very useful tool to think with, but it is often used, like various other religious things, as a cudgel. Basically what you see happen, and like let's say in Tokugawa, Japan, is essentially the creation of like a caste system. One way to think about karma is like, well, something bad happens to you, you must deserve it, right? Therefore, the social order we shouldn't challenge the social order because everything is as it should be, right? Another way to think about karma is that this time around we have ended up with a social situation like this, but we all have done everything in every possible lifetime. Right? We have been in every possible relationship with one another. In a past life, you burned down my village. In a past life, I burned down your village. At this moment, you're of this class, I'm of this class, you're of this gender, I'm of this gender. In other words, we're all actually equal. So if there's injustice, if there's discrimination, we should work to resolve that, not justify it, right? But this is one of the funny things about religious traditions is that people choose what they want to affirm or challenge. We can look to Buddhist texts if we're a misogynist and find support for those ideas. If you're a feminist, you can look to Buddhist texts and you can find support for those ideas. It's a choice. It's not a description, it's a choice. Yeah. So in that conversation about karma, that's essentially what I tried to say, is that there's not just one perspective. Yeah.
Okay. If there aren't anybody else have a question, yeah.
Thank you. I have a question. I hope, and I read your slide correctly, that you said Buddhism is not only for comfort, But it's kind of, I think I take it because by learning the Buddhism, it will kind of open the new perspective of the world. So I wonder if you can explain a little bit more about
Yes.
that.
Yeah, where was that? Yeah. So not only comfort, well, which of course means that it is partially for comfort. You know, we go to the Buddha for refuge. Like, you know, in times of trouble, where do you go? Another metaphor that I like for this is like a bank account. Like the more time and energy you invest in the Dharma, when things are tough, you have more you can draw upon. Yeah. But yeah, so on the one hand, Buddhism is something that you can go to for comfort because life is hard. Life is complicated. Being a person is challenging, right? But at the same time, the deeper into the Dharma you go, it challenges you to see the world differently, than you may automatically see it. So I think that there's also that kind of skillful aspect as well to challenge us. I think one thing I'll talk about in the next section is that I think the Shin tradition in particular is about kind of critical self-inquiry. Why do I think what I think? You know, gosh, I want to be a good Buddhist. Why? Like what is that might compel you, right, to seek, you know, the spiritual path, right? That's also tied up with ego. Right? It doesn't mean it's bad, but it means it's a thing we can interrogate. Yeah? Thank you.
Okay, well, so it brings us right on 7 o'clock. So we're going to take a short 15-minute break, and we'll resume our session with the second half. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so when I was about, 15 or so, my mother got remarried and moved to Colorado. After a while, I technically qualified for in-state tuition in Colorado, and her husband said, I will pay for college tuition if you get a job and work to pay for your living expenses. So suddenly, it looked like I was going to go to college. This is more than 25 years ago, and the standard of just taking on student loans wasn't yet a thing. So I didn't know, was I going to go? But was I going to maybe go be a bass player in Nashville, try to make it big up there? Like that was my other choice. Anyway, so college guidance counselor is like, well, what do you want to do? I was like, I don't know. She said, well, what do you like to do? Right. Now, in that moment, had I been honest, my answer would have been, well, what I'd like to do is skip class, smoke cigarettes, and read books about Zen. Is that a job? It is a job, and I have that job. It's totally rad, right? I don't smoke anymore, but like I ended up doing exactly that, right? So I go to college and I become a religious studies major. But I can remember sitting in my mom's house in Colorado reading websites of different universities to get a degree in Buddhist studies or religious studies specializing in Buddhism. You got to learn French and German so that you can access classical religious studies scholarship. And then if you work in East Asia, you got to learn, depending on what you want to do. If it's Tibet, you're probably going to learn Sanskrit and Tibetan and probably Chinese, right? If you want to work on, say, Korean Buddhism, you're going to have to learn Korean. You're going to have to learn classical Chinese and Japanese because Japanese is the most useful research language. So I'm reading all this and I can barely speak Spanish. I have no idea how I would do a thing like that, but I had the ridiculous aspiration. I was like, I'm going to try this, see how this goes. So I show up, the first day, freshman year, go to my advisor's office, tank top, dreadlock, flip-flop, and I say, hey, man, I want to study Zen, man. Now, a sensible person would have said, get the hell out of my office, hippie. Instead, he said, okay, if you're serious, learn Japanese. No matter what you want to study, Japanese is the most useful research language for the study of Buddhism. So I did. I started studying Japanese. I had this wonderful Japanese teacher, Saegusa Sensei, and she had this beautiful way about her. She was able to convey her deep dissatisfaction with my poor performance with this sweet smile. I would come in having not done my homework, having not prepared, and she would just smile. And I'm so sorry. Right. So I walk in second semester of Japanese. I don't understand a word. Not a good student. Right. Then later on, working at a gas station, I asked my manager if I could switch schedules. So I worked the graveyard shift, so I could get up and go to Japanese class, go home and sleep, go back to work, study Japanese, in the gas station, right? Call the cops when people, are, having a time, and then go back to studying Japanese. And I did that for a summer, right? I got caught back up intensive Japanese with Saegusa Sensei, by the way. She kindly guided me through the first few years of Japanese. She got to see the transition from, I have no idea what college is, I'm here to party, to, I think I want to be a scholar, like for realsies, So anyway, a lot of gratitude for her putting up with me at a complicated time. But anyway, becoming a scholar of Buddhism is very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. You've got to so you study, taxonomies, different kinds of religion, philology, a lot of language study, comparative methodologies. My advisors in undergrad were really fun. I had some people who were kind of old school 1960s, kind of classical essentialists, history of religion types. I had the hardcore postmodernist French philosophical types. I had the conservative philologists who just said, learn the language, right? And I got to work with all of them. It was really good. And they all disagreed on a whole bunch of stuff. It was hilarious, right? But it's complicated. That's a lot to do. I would try to take a class and I wouldn't understand half of what was happening, but you keep showing up. If you want a thing, you keep showing up until they tell you to go away. So the study of religion is complicated. You got to learn a bunch of languages. Right? So in my case, I mostly spend my time reading academic Japanese, which means my spoken Japanese is weird. And I spend the rest of my time reading classical Chinese because everything, all the language of religion was classical Chinese. A scholar, Victor Mayer, who recently passed away, he said that classical Chinese is the other Latin. In Europe, you go home and speak Spanish or Portuguese or French or English, and you go to work and you write Latin, right? In East Asia, you might go home and speak Vietnamese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese. You go to work and you're writing in classical Chinese, yeah? So all that's complicated. It just takes years. It takes time and energy and, but eventually things start to cohere. And as well, the Buddhist tradition as well can have its complicated side, like the deep philosophy stuff, yeah. Buddhism, and I would say Shin Buddhism in particular, can often be about interrogating what you think you know, challenging you to foster epistemic humility. What do I think I know? Why do I know what I think I know? Yeah. Have I gotten it wrong? And you keep coming back to that. Like, oh, I got it wrong. Okay, try again. I got it wrong. I keep trying, right? Don't stop. When we were talking about the Heart Sutra, same thing. Keep going. Don't stop. Beyond, beyond, beyond. Gate, gate, paragate. And these two approaches, the academic approach, the Buddhist philosophical approach, these are not necessarily at odds with one another. Two of my favorite scholars said, the point of Buddhism is to see the world as it is. The point of Buddhist studies is to see Buddhism as it is. So there can be some overlap. In the classroom, I like to challenge students to think critically and historically. Let a student come in and say, we'll read the Lotus Sutra, we'll read the Pure Land Sutras, and they'll say, what's with all the jewels? These jeweled trees and golden this and that? I thought Buddhism was non-materialistic. I never told you that. I never said that in this classroom. Where did you get that idea? Right? I show them pictures of Zen breakfast cereal and Zen alarm clocks and Zen massage parlors, and it's great. You go looking at like all the ads that have the word Zen in them, right? Students come in with all sorts of ideas, but then through careful analysis of texts and learning about history and reading what Buddhism is actually about, like, oh wow. This one time in my Zen seminar, I'm walking out the door and a group of students are chatting about something. It was like, hey guys, what are you talking about? And one student turns around, well, I was just saying how your class is kind of a bait and switch. Wait, in a good way or a bad way? Like, what does that mean? It's like, no, in a good way. Because you come in thinking you're getting Zen, then you get like Zen. At the beginning of class, they say Zen is relaxing and peace and yoga, man, By the end of the class, they go, Zen is lineage. Like, yes, that is correct. Zen is lineage. Right? Similarly, in the Sangha hall, right? Many of the sanghas, especially in Japan, you have this, the name, Shinran's honorific name, Kenshin. Yeah, to see the truth. So, from this view, right? From this perspective, right view is not, it's not the end of the conversation, but rather it's the middle way, refusing any fixed position. Keep going. As Shin Buddhists, we don't say, oh, aha, I've got it. Keep going. Right? Until we reach the Pure Land, keep going. Don't arrive at a position where you say, oh gosh, what a good Buddhist I am. Nope. Check yourself. Try again. Keep going. Don't stop. So, in both cases, right, again, the academic study of Buddhism, the practical study of Buddhism, these are not necessarily mutually opposed to one another. Stop seeing what you assume to be the case and see what there is. This is the A, so the Kenshin, this is the A+. Right? As a chronically A- student, right? I understand the value of the A+. Doesn't mean we all hit that, and that's fine. That's the goal. You keep going. You keep aspiring. You keep practicing. I think this is one of the great misunderstandings about the Shin tradition. This is something that Tokudo really taught me, is you think of, many people think of Shin Buddhism as the Buddhism where you don't have to do anything. Then why was I so tired during Tokudo? There's a lot of work to do. Ray mentioned that I got that honorific ? Title Honcho? Okay? So I'm looking at the schedule. I'm not crying, you're crying. I'm looking at the schedule. How am I going to do this? Like, I'm almost panicking. Okay? Deep breathing. You've done Zen. That's fine. We're okay. And then they hand a name tag. Oh, good. I got a name tag. Nice. What's this other thing? Honcho? All right, that's where the English word head honcho comes from, the group leader. Deep in my heart, I am screaming an expletive, quietly in my heart. And then I have an image, like there's a joke about what do you hand a drowning guitar player? His amp. Someone was handing me an amp. Like, I'm drowning, and now you're giving me a guitar amp. Thanks, that's very helpful. So I'm looking at these, and I'm like, how am I going to do this? The honcho, you have to assign, okay, who's cleaning toilets, who's, doing this, but also like, who's going to lead the chanting? Who's going to ring the bell? There's all these chores to assign. You want to rotate. You want to think about, okay, who's really good at this? Who's really good at that? We're the foreigner group. I want us to look good, up there. I get up to my room, right? And my friends here, like, hey, we got you. You're not doing this on your own, right? And then something magical happens. As I'm focusing on, straightening people's, wagesa, as I'm checking people's temperatures, as I'm doing the job of the honcho, I'm suddenly a lot less stressed out, and I'm much more concerned with helping others. There's this magical thing that happens when you're less focused on yourself and more focused on being of service to others, being part of the team, right? things got a lot easier, right? So it became a gift. This thing that made me, seize up for a moment there, ended up being a really wonderful lesson in the Dharma, right? Anyway, I just want to share that story because it was a whole thing. It's very lucky. Okay. So the academic study of Buddhism, the practical study of Buddhism, encourages us to challenge ourselves. Critical self-inquiry is an important part of Dharma practice. It's an important part of the academic study as well. Okay, back to this guy. Okay, Eugene Burnouf, 1844, publishes a new thing, the history of Indian Buddhism. And this sets the terms of the dialogue about Buddhism for the next 150 years. He says that there was the simple suttas, right? The Pali Canon, that's original Buddhism. That's real Buddhism. That's Indian Buddhism. That's the Buddhism of the Buddha. Then the Mahayana comes along and, oh, how weird. These Vaipulya sutras, these long-ass sutras. He didn't like those. But what was even worse is the Tantras. They talk about women as if they're spiritually good. Female sexuality is a source of power. Ew, he says. Right? And then even worse, you get to Lamaism. They didn't even use the term Tibetan Buddhism yet. They said Lamaism. This is also a term in Chinese, Lama Jiao, which actually comes from Japanese. Right? So European scholars, Lamaism becomes Japanese Lama Kyo, becomes the Chinese Lama Jiao, which is still in use in contemporary Mandarin. Right? It's not a neutral term. Right? That's a derogatory term, Lamaism. Because it's saying, this is so weird, it's not even Buddhism. Right? There's a great, a Shingon monk, Toki Horyu, who goes to the 1893 World Parliament of Religions. He presents stuff about Shingon. And in his speeches, he's like, oh yeah, like Japanese Shingon, we are the Goldilocks of Tantra. Paraphrasing, of course. Is you got the early stuff, and that's like weird spells and whatnot. And you got the later stuff, that's Tibetan Buddha, or that's Lamaism. And then the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold, that's Shingon. We're the good guys. Right? We get it, we get Tantra right. Right? Now, this is something that some scholars in Japan still talk about. They still talk this way. Like, this is not long ago and far away. Later on, though, he goes and meets Tibetans in India. He's like, oh, I was wrong. These guys are pretty cool. That's great. So this is the model that we receive. This is the model for the academic study of Buddhism for at least the first 100 years. I would say that by the 70s to some extent, by the 90s to some extent, you start to see this shift. You begin to see more Buddhists, more scholars of Buddhism who happen to either be Asian or Buddhist or both, who are beginning to, guide the discipline in a different direction. The problem is that this model, Burnouf's Buddha, the scientific Buddha model, becomes the foundation for English writing on Buddhism. So if you are, the type of person who spends time on the internet reading about Buddhism, that's the Buddhism you're going to encounter. Not 100%, but that's a lot of it. You go to Barnes & Noble, you pick up a book, that's probably what you're going to receive, right? And it's, a particular perspective marketed to a particular audience, right? But we can break this down. Like Nagarjuna, we can obliterate the wrong views of being and non-being. Nagarjuna is one of my favorites. That's why I keep talking about Nagarjuna. If it's not Nagarjuna, I'll be talking about Nietzsche randomly for some reason, right? So this inherited picture is wrong in a lot of ways. And to Burnouf's credit, a lot of what he was saying, he was proposing as hypotheses, not as declarations about history. Like, he didn't know. He was doing his best, right? And as I mentioned last time, whatever early Mahayana was, it developed within mainstream monastic communities, not as some breakaway thing, not Hindu influence, not Zoroaster. It's something that evolves internally in the early Buddhist world before the texts are written down. The so-called Pali Canon is not equivalent to early Buddhism. Foundational, yes. Important, yes. Good for you to read, yes, right? But what we have now is a product of redaction and editing and choices made a long time ago. Yeah? The Buddhist tradition circulates orally for hundreds of years before anything is written down. And the thing, the Pali Canon claims to have been written down at a particular time. We have evidence for Mahayana sutras being written down also around that time. So it's not like you had one and then something else is tacked on later. Now there's a lot of texts that are demonstrably late that you can say, aha, I see what you did there. This is coming later. But it's a lot murkier than we're often told. Right? The search for one clean origin is the wrong kind of question. As I mentioned previously, when we look at New Testament studies or Buddhist studies, the further back we get, it doesn't get more simple. It gets more complicated, actually. I like the example of Nagarjuna. Right? Every school of Mahayana Buddhism looks to Nagarjuna as a founder. Even the ones that don't include Shakyamuni, they include Nagarjuna. Of course you're going to include Nagarjuna, right? So we tend to think of him as a Mahayana guy. Everybody Mahayana loves him. However, it's a little more complicated than that. One could also make the case, and the scholars like Luis Gomez do, make the argument that Nagarjuna could also be thought of as like a conservative. That he saw the Abhidharma philosophy as, kind of attributing certain ideas to the Buddha that the Buddha didn't say. So when Nagarjuna is talking about emptiness, what he's really talking about is dependent arising, which last time we said is like basically the essence of the Buddha's awakening under the Bodhi tree. He's talking about no self. He's talking about impermanence. The core Buddhist ideas, that's what Nagarjuna is talking about. He's re-articulating what the Buddha was saying and using that to critique what he felt were, flourishes in the philosophical world of his time, right? Nothing inherently Mahayana about that, interestingly enough, yeah? So again, we can break down these categories, draw upon Nagarjuna and break down these categories. And of course, who else sees Nagarjuna as a founder? Shinran, right? Shinran looks to Nagarjuna, right? The easy path. And so for a long time, I thought of Nagarjuna as just some guy that everybody kind of, puts their stuff on. Nagarjuna as a Pure Land guy, oh yeah, of course, Pure Land guys are going to say that, right? I didn't realize that thinking of Nagarjuna as an aspirant for the Pure Land is a pan-Mahayana thing. It's not limited to Shinran. It's not limited to Pure Land Buddhists. It's just assumed. Yeah? You have the Lankavatara Sutra that has a prophecy about Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu and Ashvaghosha and other, aspiring for rebirth in the Pure Land. Right? You have a lot of Tibetan traditions about this as well. Chinese traditions and other schools, it's just assumed. So my assumption when it comes to someone like Nagarjuna, did the historical individual Nagarjuna aspire for Pure Land rebirth? Who knows? Nobody knows, right? There's some interesting circumstantial evidence. Possibly the part of India where Nagarjuna may have lived is also where we happen to find early images of Amitabha. I would like to imagine him as a Pure Land aspirant, right? You wake up in the morning, offering flowers before an image of Amitabha Buddha, and then go write angry letters to people saying, I'm breaking down your whole philosophical worldview. I love that, right? In the Junidai, it says, the world, reality is ephemeral, like an illusion. Therefore, I take refuge in Amitabha. That therefore, you always say when you're analyzing a text, what's that therefore? Therefore, I rely upon Amitabha. Right? Now, contemporary philosophers who dig Nagarjuna won't understand why does Pure Land and Nagarjuna fit together. But we have 2,000 years of Buddhists seeing that as perfectly sensible. I'm going to believe them, personally. Right? But anyway. In the same way that we can be critical or look critically upon certain Buddhist studies assumptions, we can also look at our own tradition. This is one of the challenges I faced when I was beginning my dissertation work is I wanted to work on Pure Land, but the first problem is there's so much written in Japanese about Pure Land, right? At that time, I couldn't read Japanese fast enough for that to be my topic. There's too much to read, right? So I picked something a little more ambitious, or a little less ambitious at that time. One of the other problems I noticed at this time, as I'm trying to read all this material, is that there's a kind of tunnel vision in some Shin Buddhist scholarship. Right? We keep coming back to the same topics. We're kind of stuck in an echo chamber, and we're saying this. It's like, yeah, but like, what else is going on? What else is happening? That's why I worked on esoteric Pure Land, because I wanted to know what else is going on around the time of Shinran, right? Also, there's a lot less written about it, so I could actually read everything. Right? One of the problems that we see with the Shin scholarship is a tendency to kind of attribute everything to our lineage, right? But what that ends up doing is it decontextualizes the Pure Land path as if it's this thing that is owned by Shinran and owned by us, when in fact the Pure Land path is fundamental to what makes Mahayana work. No independent Pure Land schools in India or China. Aspiration for rebirth and Sukhavati runs throughout Mahayana literature, understood in about 10 different ways, but that's cool too. Buddha fields are just, not only limited to Mahayana texts, but the idea of Buddha Kshetra or Buddha Kaheta in Pali, we see in Abhidhamma, Mahavastu, and other texts that are, outside the standard Mahayana view, and then show us that early Buddhism had this diverse cosmology. For all Buddhist traditions, doctrine and cosmology are not really separable from one another. Out there and in here are not two distinct things. This gives, in using this term Mahayana multiverse, I want us to think about the Shin path as an expression of something that actually encompasses the whole of the Mahayana, the whole of Buddhism even. Right? So the point of my first talk here at the Buddhist Study Center is to say that Pure Land is part of what makes Mahayana tick. And similarly, Shin Buddhism is basic Buddhism. We don't have to think about, well, you have the Buddhism of the Buddha and the Buddhism of Shinran, and I don't know, don't worry about that, right? Because all this stuff is actually present fully within the teachings of Shinran. Right? But we have all that stuff. So we can think broadly about the Mahayana, we can think broadly about Buddhism in general from within the Shin tradition. We have a lot of opportunities to, share that dialogue across supposed divisions. But this comes as well from thinking critically about a received view from Buddhist studies, but also thinking critically of our received view from the kind of standard sectarian narrative. We can do both. Whoop, sorry. Wait. All right. Shinran's historical account was often read backwards onto the whole of the tradition. And that can be useful theologically, but it can cause problems when we're engaging in historical analysis. I like to think of the 7 masters as a way for us to think broadly about the Buddhist tradition. When Shinran is invoking Nagarjuna, it's not just that one little passage that we like. Right? Remember, Shinran is not speaking to Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. Shinran is speaking to people from all different traditions. So when he's invoking Nagarjuna, a contemporary from the Shingon or Tendai tradition is like, oh yeah, he also was was seen as the founder of Tendai. He was also receiving the esoteric teachings from the Vajra Sattva in the Iron Pagoda, right? And talks about this easy path, and that's what Shinran is referencing. So for his contemporaries, when Shinran talks about, Nagarjuna, he's pulling in his contemporaries of the Shingon, Tendai, Hosso, Keigon traditions as well. When Shinran talks about, the vow of Amida Buddha as the one vehicle, his Tendai friends are gonna, their little spider sense, oh, that's just like the Lotus Sutra. Right? Like that's what's gonna be going on in the back of their mind, and that's how he's bringing people on board, right? If we think about our tradition only in these narrowly defined terms, then we're going to miss the way that Shinran was reaching out to his contemporaries and bringing them onto the one vehicle, right? And we may miss our own opportunities to do that as well, right? So, as well, I think of one of Shinran's key insights to be about critical inquiry. So I mentioned this term critical self-inquiry is one of Shinran's key insights. When he's critiquing self-power, he's not saying, you Buddhists are doing it wrong, simply. He's saying, when I approach the spiritual path, my ego is going to show up. So I have to be in this process of refining it. Right? One of my favorite episodes is when he gets sick and he starts chanting. He's like, what's the point? What am I going to do in this moment? So he's, critically reassessing his own practice, his own perspective. And it's not like he figured it out and then everything was perfect. He's like older when that event happens. So he's still in this process of critical self-reflection, checking himself, observing, like, oh, I have this habit from my training, right? I have a lot of habits from my training down south, that are not necessarily, healthful, right, or helpful right now, right? Shinran as well is in that process of kind of reevaluating himself. One of the other pieces of this critique of agendas, critique of self-power, is also a critique of those who claim authority over the path. I have this student who lives a former student who lives in Tokyo, and he says, hey man, why don't we have the talismans and stuff? It's like, I know, that stuff's cool. I love the hocus pocus. The problem with that, though, is that if you're going to buy into things like faith healing, that means you're going to have to buy into the idea there's a guy, it's usually a guy, not always, but usually, and that guy has some special access you don't. Right? Shinran says, Scholars, priests, and scholar priests can all get caught up in this game. And that, this is, again, one of the things that I think is powerful about the Shin tradition is that the priest functions as a facilitator, not a guru, not an enlightened master. Your senseis might, our senseis, and I'm still very much a student here, right? Our senseis may chant better, I had this great moment at the, when training for Tokudo, one of our trainers says, I would love to come see one of your lectures because I can't imagine you're this quiet when you're talking about like something you're excited about. I was like, yeah, you're right. I can't hold a tune. I'm practicing. I'm getting it. Like if I have my guitar on my body and I play the D, I can make the D note, but it's hard, right? Right. So we learn to help facilitate your religious experience, right? But the minister can't give you shinjin, right? That's an important distinction. That's an important part of the critique that our tradition offers. So the question my student had, yes. Oh, are you switching? Oh, yeah. Gotcha. Okay. All right. Thank you. Right. Okay. So was this priest that my student was talking, oh yeah, that sounds way better. Okay. Was this priest that my student encountered, were they serving themselves? Were they serving my student, right? This priest, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I imagine this priest was kind of falling into the trap that, spiritual elitism can lead us to. But we are lucky to be part of a tradition that encourages us to redirect that critical inquiry. Right? There's something about that as a scholar of religion I find very encouraging, because a scholar of religion has to do the same thing. We look critically at what texts purport to say. Right? When the Brahmin priest says we're at the top of society, we go, of course you would say that. But as a scholar of religion, we also direct that critical inquiry at ourselves. What are my blind spots? Right? That's the point of peer review, is that my friends are going to tear apart something I write if it's wonky, right? So that critical inquiry is something that we share with each other, right? So as a scholar of religion, that's one reason why I find the Shin path so compelling, is because that same critical sense is front and center. Right, we talk about Burnouf, the early Buddhist studies, Orientalists. They had a particular agenda. and that agenda shows up. They didn't have the tools to critically assess what they were doing necessarily. All right. So back to Kenshin. Seeing truth. All right, this is what we're aspiring to. All right. So, wrapping things up, we say that Buddhism is simple. Buddhism meets people where they are in moments of grief, the oranges on the altar. Buddhism is also actually quite complicated because it asks us to keep going, to keep asking, how can I better see the truth? Buddhist studies is complicated, right? History, method, language learning, and at present, undoing 150 years of, inherited agenda-laden assumptions. Scholars of Buddhism have a lot of work to do. Yeah. One time I was giving a presentation, and I think I was talking about like sectarianism in Japanese studies, something like that, right? A scholar, a scholar with a PhD is like, yeah, we know this. This is not new information. I was like, okay, you know it because you're the 1% of the 1%. Good for you. Next person that had the mic was a minister who said, this is exactly what we're taught. We need to learn this new stuff that you're like. So for a lot of people, or like if you look online, this older model is still very operative. So it's important to keep the critique as part of the conversation as well. Like, yes, I know the PhD from Fancy Pants University. Yeah, I know you know this. Like, I read your book, right? But they haven't, So there's still a lot of work to do. I have noticed in academic Buddhist studies and kind of practical Buddhist studies, women are on the vanguard. So if you want to know who's doing the cutting edge work, like I mentioned the book Living Theravada by Brooke Shednick, right? Like, look at what women scholars are doing, because they're the ones that are pushing the new ways of thinking, like the new directions in the field. Yeah. I enjoy the good old, philological study of languages and ancient texts. I love that stuff. Like that's what I do, right? But when I go to conferences, I don't only go to those panels. I go to the panels of, contemporary Buddhism, new Buddhism, women in Buddhism, et cetera, because there's an energy. There's also a loving collegiality that, the philologist may or may not have. The old phrase was that Buddhist studies scholars eat their young. Thankfully, that is beginning to change. I, however, got to experience all the fun stuff, so that was great. So again, Kenshin, right? To see the truth, linking seminar room, Sangha hall, the critique of the philologist desk, is we're striving to see things as they are, while also recognizing what are our blind spots, what are the filters through which we view the world. Whenever I talk about Yogacara psychology, I like to say that you have like a fishbowl over your head, and you're walking around day to day, you bump into the fishbowl, it gets all foggy, and now you're not seeing the world. You see the filter through which you see the world, right? The world's out there, but you don't see it. You see, the filter. So, may we continue to aspire for seeing the truth, and I'll conclude there. And I look forward to hearing any thoughts or questions you may have. Thank you. Namandavats, 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 namandavats. Hi.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Aaron. It's so hard. It's like when we're talking about Reverend Dr. Burt, when we call it, it's the same thing as Reverend Dr. Aaron. I would know him as Aaron.
You just call me Aaron. Yeah, or Aaron is fine too.
Aaron.
Like, either one.
Aaron.
Yeah.
So thank you for your talk. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yeah.
Oh, that was pretty good. Yeah.
So, you talked a lot about being a scholar practitioner, right? So I guess in the academy, right, and when you go to the AAR, you go to these conferences and other things, as a scholar practitioner, right, how do you navigate some of that kind of pushback on, from the traditional,
Well, one of my dearest mentors scholar of Taoism, Terry Kleeman, has been trying to convince me to be a scholar of Taoism for about 25 years now. One time he jokingly said, like, come on, just be a scholar of Taoism. We're way better. Like, you guys are all just Buddhist. I'm like, yes. But anyway, so he was kind of teasing me there. As I mentioned, for scholars of religion, the stereotype that we're all atheists, or not, but anyway, like, is that actually most of the people happen to belong to the traditions they study, right? That's been the case since the 1700s. The early scholars of, critical historical scholars of the Bible, 1700s and on, they tend to be theologians, right? Ministers who are learning about how, oh hey, Moses didn't write the Torah. We have at least 4 or 5 different authors we can identify, that sort of thing, right? Same thing with Buddhist studies. However, the ability to be out as Buddhist in the academy, that's fairly recent. I'm forgetting the name of the scholar, but he's often written about how back in the 60s when he was a Buddhist scholar, that was a point of contention, like seriously, right? Now again, younger, especially younger scholars tend to be pretty chill. Yeah. And I think as this gets wider, I'm no longer probably in the younger scholar camp, but that's okay. Reminds me when I was reading Life of the Buddha with my daughter, or reading the four sights. The old man, the sick man, the dead man. And didn't mention that the father, Buddha's father is Buddha doesn't know about old age because his dad was maybe dyeing his beard. She looks up at me. This is almost 10 years ago, so this was a lot less white. She sees a little bit of white. She's like, "Are you gonna die?" Like, well, not right now, but like someday, yes, of course, right? So that'd be that's part of the story, right? In any case, like among the younger scholars, it's not a big deal, right? Because we know that you can be a Buddhist and be a terrible scholar, right? You can be a great scholar and not be a Buddhist. One of my favorite scholars, Paul Swanson, and also a participant in the Christian tradition, one of the best scholars of Buddhism we have. Translated Jur'is, Moha Jirguan, Makashgan, right? So we know this. So it's not, the controversy is not real. Some people bring it up. It's the moribund equine we all like to flagellate, right? But it's not, not really worth our time. Yeah. And one thing that I hope to be able to do is, as a professional scholar who is also now a minister, is to help create more space for that type of dialogue. Right? We don't have to leave our brain at the door to be a practicing Buddhist. Yeah.
All right, does anyone have any more questions or comments?
Any of our online friends?
Nothing online. All right.
All right.
Yeah.
In Ken Tanaka's book, I think I was just mentioning it to you, that's currently in draft, it's Ocean 2, talks about Japanese term chomon, which is like a sincere listening and trying to understand, and basically trying to do what you're doing tonight, is sincere listening. And that is the analogy is that helps to till the soil, but you have to kind of tend to the garden, and the deep listening is tilling the soil and watering the soil and fertilizing the soil, but the seed you can't do anything about. The seed is going to grow in its time. So one's understanding is like a seed, or classically the lotus seed, and when it's time and you've tilled the soil and taken care of it or chomoned it enough, it'll happen. So that's how the kind of a simple way of, well, how do I get to be a Buddhist? So maybe that's, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I like that. So one thing that comes to mind is so lotus root is one of my favorite things. Yeah, I could eat that all day. But then I saw what a lotus root looks like. Right? Has anyone ever seen one of these things? Okay, so one of our friends was working on an organic farm in Kumamoto, and then she came up to visit with us and showed us some pictures. lotuses are apparently rhizomatic. I didn't know this. Right, so the common Buddhist metaphor for lotuses is, it's in the muck and the mud, and then it grows up and it's pristine, and that's real nice, right? But they're also rhizomatic, which means that below the surface they're all connected. That's really cool too, right? But then she shows this picture of her. She's in high waders. She's holding this, space goblin monster thing, these long tubers with tendrils. Is that I think your dog is sick. What are you holding? It's really kind of terrifying looking. Right? Anyway, below the surface, lotuses are all connected. These tubers kind of grow underneath, and then they send up the shoots, right? In the same way, we are all, en route, right? The seed is growing, and we're also connected, right, all below the surface. And also that observation about things taking their due time. That's in the Lotus Sutra. It talks about the Dharma rain. The cloud, is raining, and all the plants receive their nutrients and grow in their own way. The tree, the flower, they're all receiving the same, Dharma rain, and slowly, they grow and perfume their own way.
Yeah, I think in Tokudo they were talking about persimmon, kaki.
Yeah,
if you get young kaki and you eat young kaki, it's very bitter. Mm-hmm. But over time, it gets sweeter.
That's right. Yeah. Kaki was the other thing that my friends in Kumamoto gave me. Yeah. They get the boxes of oranges, but then lots of kaki here and there too. Yeah.
Kaki's a persimmon.
Persimmon. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. A lot of these words I only know in Japanese. Actually, I go to sushi restaurants in English. I don't know what any of this is.
Aaron, what do you think about how we say the Nembutsu in Shin Buddhism? We are grateful, but in other Buddhist traditions, Nembutsu sometimes is seen as help me, help me, Jesus, something like that.
Right.
So, can we, as Shin Buddhists, also ask Amida, please help me?
Very interesting question. So that distinction is really important and really interesting, right? The Shin approach is unique, right? And I've noticed many times, in the event that a scholar may deign to speak about Shin Buddhism, they assume it's just the same, right? That we're saying, please save me, Buddha Jesus, right? And that's not how the Nembutsu functions for Shin Buddhists, right? But I think also, I was just hearing a story from someone about, that they're going to the temple and, that they're in mourning, and there's a face. Right? Buddha has a face in the image, and that really connected with them, and that made it tangible. I think that there are times when you reach out and you say, I need help. Right? I have a humorous example, if you'll indulge me. Before going to Kyoto for a summer research trip, one of my professors warned me. He said, Aaron, I need to warn you about Kyoto Buddhist studies drinking culture. It's like, Sensei, I'm from Tennessee. I'll be fine. It's like, you've got Japanese drinking, you've got American drinkers, you think of Japanese, or you have Japanese Buddhist studies scholars, right? It's like, Sensei, I'm fine. I'm from Jack Daniels, Tennessee. I'll be fine, right? No, he was right. Okay. So, after, you go to the conference, and Kyoto is like, it's Buddhist studies Matsuri time, right? There's this conference at Ryukoku, this one at Otani, this one, et cetera. You go to this one, then there's drinks, then there's karaoke, then there's more drinks, Nichikai, Sanchikai, et cetera. I get to this point where I'm like, I'm hurting. Like my body, my soul, my not self, I'm hurting. So I have a trip up to Mount Hiei, and I go before the medicine Buddha. I'm like, I don't normally do this sort of thing, but I'm hurting. I got my omomori and whatnot, but again, I don't do that sort of thing. But I had this moment of just like, I need to take a break from Japanese Buddhist studies academic culture for a week. Anyway, it was funny, but we can delve deeply into the philosophy. We can, appreciate. I really love the Nembutsu scroll. It feels kind of abstract and philosophical. It's the name that calls, But there are times when Buddha has a face, you have like the world eye is one of the names for the Buddha, right? Tibetan traditions, you have the big stupa, but with the two eyes on it, right? That can be a way for people to connect, like a way in, But when I was younger, I was very anti any kind of anthropomorphization, right? And then I got a little older, life got a little harder, and calling out Namo Amida Butsu connected for me, right? So I can conclude with one more short little story. When I first moved to Kumamoto, I was very stressed out because I realized suddenly how alone I was going to be, right? People really didn't speak English, and I didn't know anybody. So I was really stressed out. So I was like, I know, I'll meditate my way through it. No, that made it worse, right? And then I was like, well, I remember there's this thing, Namo Amida Butsu. What is that? I tried that. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida. I just sat with it, And I started to feel like a shift. I felt, I don't know, something. I was like, what was that? Maybe I was now controlling my breath and, neurochemical, whatever. But I've spent the last 20 years trying to figure out what that was, right? There's something to it, and if you want a Buddha with a face, call out, save me Amida, that's what you need, that's what you need, right? If you want to look deeply into, the three truths, of the Tiantai tradition or whatever, you can do that too, right? So I think we have that elasticity. To omotte orimasu.
All right. With that, thank you again, Reverend Aaron. Aaron.
Yes, sir.
We'll have time afterwards if you guys want to hang out for our Ohana. But I just wanted to why don't we give Aaron a round of applause? It was a really good job this past 3 days. Now he's actually going to be here in Hawaii for a little bit longer, and I wanted to kind of just go over some of the upcoming things that he has. So Aaron's going to be going to Kauai on July 30th. That session, it's from 6:30 to 8 p.m. It'll be online as well. And then he'll be going to Hawaii Island and going to Holuola Honganji's Obong service at 10 a.m. and seeing my parents. Also, Honokao Honganji at 3 p.m. His topic there will be the real Buddhism of the Honganji, and there's also a Zoom option there available. Be returning back on August 4th at Waipahu Honganji, and then flying out to Maui on August 9th at Kahului Honganji for their Sunday service. So a busy schedule. And then we also have one more event that Reverend Hasebi wanted to talk about.
Thank you very much, Dr. Proffitt. I'm a member of the Honpa Honganji Mission Hawaii Monsintho Task Force. And the Monsintho Task Force is planning to the special event called Dharma on Draft. And then the special guest with Dr. Proffitt. And then the few seats is still available. So if the date is July 31 at the 6:30 p.m. at the Ala Moana Side Street Inn. And if you're interested, please contact Dwight, and his email is matsuodwight14@gmail.com, and or you can contact me as well. So looking forward to see you there too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And like all things of dependent origination, thank you all for joining us this past 3 days. Even if you came for a first time or over the period, without you, we wouldn't have Aaron to come down and vice versa. So let's keep that in mind. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll see you guys at next year's summer session. Thank you.